Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the events director at Literati bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Claudio Lomnitz in support of Nuestra América in conversation with Eugene Kamarov. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you might want to keep the chat window open as we'll be sending links to purchase Nuestra América from Literati during the event. There is also, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description right below me. If you're watching live, you can also submit questions for the Q&A portion using the Q&A feature available to you either at the top or at the bottom of your screen at any time, and I'll read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of Claudia and Jean's conversation. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this month's or this week's or today's subscription to our events, you can make a donation at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where or when in the world you may be joining us from. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Claudio Lomnitz is an anthropologist, historian, and critic who works broadly on Latin American culture and politics. He's professor of anthropology at Columbia University. Lomnitz's books include Death and the Idea of Mexico and the Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, among many others. As a regular columnist in the Mexico City paper La Jornada and an award-winning dramaturgist, he is committed to bringing historical and anthropological understanding into public debate. Eugene Kamarov is the Alfred North Whitehead Professor of African and African American Studies and Anthropology at Harvard University, an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town. Educated at the University of Cape Town and the London School of Economics, she was formerly the Bernard E. and Ellen C. Sunny Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago. Her research, primarily conducted in Southern Africa, has focused on the interplay of capitalism, modernity, and colonialism, and on theorizing the contemporary world from beyond its hegemonic centers. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Eugene Kamarov and Claudio Lomnitz into your living rooms.
Thank you. We're delighted to be here, and I wanted to thank Jean for engaging in this conversation. It's a celebratory moment for me, because I'm here with Jean, but also because Nuestra América is just out this week, this book. And so, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here, Claudia. This is a reconnection of a very old collaborative relationship. We are both peoples of the South and the North, and I think we feel a great deal in common in relation to particularly this project. So are you going to read, or should I just start our conversation?
If you like, go ahead and start. I have some things that I could read, but
let's see how we go. Okay. So Claudia, this is a remarkable book, a joy to read, and a complex text. Yeah, it's an autobiography, it's a family memoir, but it's also a history, and a history from the margins, a particular kind of history. And a history that relates really this modern universalist left-leaning kind of Jewish humanism and its role in the 20th century. But it's also in contrapuntal relationship with this agonistic history of nationalism, 20th century nationalism, and its various forms of violence, right? And it's the story that's told through the lives of what you beautifully call the forced witnesses to the story of nationalism, right? These insider Auslanders, as it were, the homo sacri, if we want to call that. Yeah. And it's a history for those for whom things like citizenship, security, nationality remain to a large degree a kind of elusive ideal. So it's also a history of migration and exile. But most of all, it seemed to me, and this is what I wanted to start our discussion thinking about, is a history told by those people whom you beautifully show are the sort of side people, the two-bit players, the people who stand adjacent to the real heroes of the main action, as it were. And it's precisely because of their efforts to try and find meaning in their journeys, largely forced, but to give them also purpose, some self-direction, that they come upon these extraordinary insights, and they're often critical insights, which mean that this history is a kind of counter-history. It's not a hegemonic history. Its time and its space is different. So this struck me while I was reading it. I don't think you make that point in the book, but I couldn't remember. I tried to look for it today. It reminds me so much of the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, right? And the sort of writing of somebody like Tom Stoppard, who himself, of course, is a Jewish family moving from Eastern Europe to the center. And there again, he's telling us the story of, how characters on the margins of the main action sometimes stumble onto some of the most profound insights. So I wondered if you wanted to think a little bit and talk a little bit about that to start us off.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a big thing in this book, and I think it's an important thing for me, because two of the key characters here were my maternal grandparents, are exactly what you're saying. When I started writing the book, I started looking through a bunch of photos that my mother still had, and I got this feeling like in that Woody Allen movie Zelig. All of a sudden my grandfather would be here and there and there and there, near all of these significant people, certainly for South America, very significant people. Next to Alejandro Lifshitz, who wrote one of the first big books on race and racism in Latin America, or next to Pablo Neruda, or next to Jose Carlos Mariátegui, next to all these people who were very famous in my world, in the Latin American world. And it's always sort of next to, and you almost thought maybe he had been photoshopped there, like in that Woody Allen movie. It was really there. And what did it mean that he was there, and why, and what did he give them? Right? What did she, my grandmother, give, Mariátegui? They were, my grandparents, these maternal grandparents, were truly of the intimate circle of this guy, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, whose name doesn't mean that much in English, but it means a tremendous amount in Spanish. He's one of the great Marxists of the 20th century, I think, anywhere. A figure that's often been compared to Gramsci and people like that. And why was he interested in them, and how did they connect? And I think that this is one of the things that was hardest for me to understand, because, for example, in the case of Mariátegui, which is an important, who's an important player, especially in the first part of the book, but in their lives was a very important player. I had to really read his work in a different way than what I had, say, in college or something like that. It involved reinterpreting some canonical work.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I didn't know how to pronounce his name, but he's an extraordinary voice in the book, because he voices something which in many senses is a displaced voice for you too, because a lot of what he's saying is very central to your vision of this kind of idea of a kind of peripheral centrality, a whole vision of everything from Zionism to the way that history gets written, in a way. Yeah, and it was extraordinary in the way in which you dealt with him, because you said at one point that, and this gets to the whole question of how one writes this kind of history. You said at one point he was very difficult for you to actually take a stance on, because you had this kind of genealogical connection to him, which made him almost like a figure that it made the past very luminous, but also in a way impenetrable for you to write it. And it struck me that this whole question of how one writes this kind of history, I think you beautifully do the kind of dialogue, the interplay between personal stories and social and cultural histories. And this is not always an easy thing to do. As we know, there have been many social scientists on the left, in particular, people like Pierre Bourdieu, who've talked about the biographical illusion, right? They don't think it's a viable thing to do. And by and large, you bring it off beautifully, but you also, when you're talking about this particular man, say, there was this difficulty sometimes of taking your measure of him because he was so integrally connected, you know, and literally standing next to your grandparents in these photographs. And they had a very special relationship to him, clearly, and he to them.
No, I think that it's, for me, it's the the luminous part of those paths, which are to do with the connections between what you, I think, rightly called two-bit players and very famous people or very big moments, not necessarily famous people even, you know. So my grandfather was, there's a photo, the earliest photo of my grandfather that there is, that I was been able to find, that's in the book, was taken on the day of his bar mitzvah in Odessa, and it's in December of 1917. So, in other words, it's in the middle of the Russian Revolution. So sometimes what's happening when it's a very luminous moment or a very luminous person, I found it very demanding to write about that. It required a lot of rereading, a lot of thinking about what the experience might have actually been. Similarly, Pablo Neruda is another important figure there, more for my father than for my grandfather, although he also knew him. But understanding why, say, my father translated Las Alturas de Machu Picchu, one of Neruda's most complicated poems, and why he was interested in that, why he cared about that, given that he was a geophysicist and not a poet, right?
Yes, yeah. But it's those kinds of sinews that seem to be interesting, you know, and that's where I think, coming from a background of an ethnographic, you know, sort of methodology, and you, after all, are somebody who does an ethnography of archives as well as in real time, as it were. There's always that sense, because anthropology, after all, in many senses, is not a heroic discipline. It looks at the lives of ordinary people, but it sees them as having significance, but connecting the kind of subject, the person, to the larger forces that configure them and their worlds, and then reciprocally, where, you know, these subjects speak back to history. That's part of the methodology that in a sense you were raised to. And what's interesting is also a history of anthropologists and people who, when some of your grandparents landed up in Latin America, they became kind of homespun ethnographers, got interested in indigenous people, but also the indigenous people in their place in that history. So there's something, I think, in the way that you deal with this question that obviously has to do with not only that you're an anthropologist, but it's like in your bones, as it were.
It's that's true. I think one of the things, I mean, as you know, you and I both work with anthropology and history, but are anthropologists by formation, and in my case, I mean, I love history, and I've written one or two histories, kind of, sort of. I've never felt that the histories that I wrote were completely proper histories, but
yeah, but that's why they're such great histories, Claudio. Really are.
There's one thing that I think anthropology, I've come to love more and more about anthropology. I have to say, after having spent a long time grumbling about that discipline. But this interpersonal, intersubjective side of what we do, I think, is really liberatory. And I find, having taught at times in history departments, that although I completely love history, and I don't mean this, but there's a kind of grumpiness that goes along with being a historian, because this problem of anachronism is always gnawing at you. You know what I mean? And you're always trying to avoid it. And in some way, I think that the experience of ethnography is a little liberating from that point of view. You can go into the stuff, and at the same time, you know that there's something that you can't transcend. On the one hand, that there's no reason to get in such a foul mood because there's no way out of it, right? And on the other hand, you can construct any document from a more intersubjective.
Yeah, yes. And that kind of dialectical dimension to it is very much part of your story here. I mean, the other thing I wanted to ask you about a little bit is that this is very much it's a history from the margins, not only in terms of the small bit players, but from the America that you are dealing with. And I want to come back in a moment if we have the time, because I think you really deconstruct and queer the idea of America in very interesting ways. But what's fascinating about this history is that there's a kind of awareness on the part of these actors. They were, in a way, they were exiles, but they were liberated to do big things, kind of heroic things. So your grandparents are young, they arrive in Peru, they barely got their feet on the ground, and they're starting journals, literary journals. Mm-hmm. And they are, and they're rubbing shoulders with this great figure who, is as you say, I mean, a major theorist and they are producing a vision of history that they're part of. Mm-hmm. And it's a vision of this kind of, as you say, a local parochial cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. It's an idea that in the shtetl, from you are reaching for a more general kind of significance. Mm-hmm. And when you arrive in Peru, you're beginning to think, well, from here, from this place, we can think about the 20th century and the problems in Europe from the point of view of what's going on here. We've got to think about why does Peruvian kind of culture and tradition not bring in 80% of the local? What about the local people? Where do they fit into this? And how, when we think about that kind of emancipation, can we have the temerity to think about a larger theory of history? Yeah, that from Lima we can speak about, the global, and that it has to be a universal vision, but it's one that's always locally rooted. It doesn't go for some kind of Archimedean abstraction. It starts with that time and place and the lessons you learn from that and how that is in some senses connected to these larger forces, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I, in the end, decided on this title, Nuestra América, because the term Nuestra América, one usually associates with Martí. José Martí had famous essay, Nuestra América, although there have been several other Nuestra Américas written in Latin America. Usually the sense of it comes from Martí, that is, it's our America, that's Spanish America or Iberian America, as opposed to the US, as opposed to Anglo-America. But this is a different Nuestra América, because at a certain level, first of all, that Hispanic American Nuestra América has its own mythology, which is, you have this 3 roots, right? Or 2 roots, depending on where it's a Spanish and Indian, or Spanish and Indian and African, or indigenous and African. But this is a Jewish story. I mean, my family history is a Jewish story, but it's a Jewish story that completely commits to America. Exactly for the reason that you say, there's an emancipation that's happened in America that completes a process of emancipation that began in these shtetls. Yeah. And that also they're living at the time, of fascism in Europe, and so they also realize that America needs to be defended. Yeah. And so in that sense, they're also deeply rooted. I mean, I remember my grandfather died when I was 13, and going to their apartment, and he had these shelves of books on Bolivar, for example. Who the fuck cares? I mean, like I thought to myself, I mean, I was 13, but I already thought, well, why the hell does he have, like 4 shelves of books on Bolivar? Who cares about Bolivar? Of course, this is long before Chavez, where Bolivar became ubiquitous in a kind of horrible way, but he was interested in the people who had claimed the continent in different moments, because I think they claimed it too.
See, I think this is fascinating because there's a sense in which also, look, I come from a similar kind of exiled Jewish tradition, but it's the much more common one. It's the Anglo-Saxon one. It's Eastern Europe to North America. It's an Anglophone one, yeah. And to me, what is also wonderful about the story is that it complexifies. It's not just North America. It's North America. It's South America. It's not just English. It's Spanish. It's multilingual. Your grandparents spoke 8 languages or more each. So there's that complex kind of sort of unsettling of what America means, but also as a project. And this famous, you pronounce it Miragui? I'm not.
Mariátegui.
Mari. Okay, so he says, I'm committed to an American project, and there he's sitting in Lima, and you have the sense, and it plays off beautifully the fact that this is also a history of Jews in the 20th century, but they're not conventional Jews. Right? These are exiles. They're intensely culturally Jewish, but they're not mostly religious or believers. Right? They think of Zion, but it's not a conventional Zion, right? Because Zion can also be among the nations. It can be emancipation everywhere. America can be a Zion, right? In that sense. So there's a complicated sense in which they're international socialists. So this question that you turn over beautifully in the book, what does nationalism mean to people who've never even had the ability to have citizenship, passports, or belonging? But yet, is the idea of a Jewish homeland a trap? A closing off of the possibility of precisely that kind of ability to be transnational, international, and the power of thinking about making emancipation in many places and therefore in general. So it's an unusual history from that point of view, and but it's an intensely Jewish one. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about that at all, because there is this very strong faith in what they called our Jewish high culture. This sort of and a responsibility as to what that meant. It wasn't just a kind of aestheticism for its own sake. It always had that larger project of social emancipation, of thinking about the question of class and inequality. And so it was a very particular sort of story. It's a Jewish history, but it's not a conventional one.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to me that I had to learn, and that I learned only very partially, actually, in order to write this book. And one of the things about this book that I think is also very Jewish, at least Jewish, 20th century Jewish, is that it was a book that, in any conventional sense, was impossible to write. I mean, if I had written this as a historian, I wouldn't have embarked on it, because I don't speak half the languages that I would have needed to write it in any responsible way. And I wrote it because I felt like if I didn't write it, nobody else would. So I did the best I could. But I think that this sort of business of making do, that is at the heart of what this book is, also has a very Jewish component. That is because there's this fragility of place that's at the center of this whole story, right? They're exiled more than once, right? They're first they arrived to Peru, and then my grandfather was thrown in jail, and they were kicked out of Peru and went to Colombia, etc. So there's there are multiple exiles, and so there's a kind of precariousness to the story, and there's constant making do with what there is. And sometimes they're holding on, I think, to really thin ropes, like, for instance, when they arrive to Colombia, they don't even settle in Bogota. They settle in the provinces of Colombia, but so then my grandfather becomes a big fan of Jorge Sachs, famous Colombian 19th century Colombian romantic novel, the author of this novel called Maria. But the fanhood in part is Maria it's considered a great 19th century novel, but more than that, it's because he was Jewish. Jorge Sachs was the son of an English Jew who settled in Colombia at the time of Bolivar, in the beginning of around the time of independence. And so in some way, it's a kind of Jewish experience that is deeply minoritarian. I mean, what you're talking about, in Peru, there might have been 2,500 Jews in all of Peru in the 1920s, in all of Peru, and half of them were in the provinces. in Colombia, maybe there were 4,000. So it's a deeply minoritarian thing, which means that all of their thinking around Judaism was, on the one hand, founded on correspondence and reading, but on the other, it was done in collaboration with non-Jews.
Yes, yeah, it's interesting that the parallels. I mean, I was struck by the parallels with my own family, with the exile that went to Africa. But there were so many things that were similar. That sense that, first of all, they took many steps to get there, and that the maps were not often, there were crossings. You went back and forth, like your family went back and forth. They went back to Europe for some of the time. They came back again. So there was this kind of peripatetic movement in space. But very often they went to the smaller places and they did the same sorts of things. They were peddlers, or they worked on the kind of quotidian things. We also had soap makers. I don't know quite what that connection is, but
that was one of the very few small industries that existed in certain part of Eastern Europe. There weren't that many. So soap making and making ties for the railway. There were 2 or 3 things that they did. They
had to find the niche because they were locked out of agrarian. I mean, there were all these kinds of constraints that were placed on it. It cultivated a certain kind of ingenuity, right? There was precisely that. But starting in the small towns and then moving for the rituals to the larger centers and building always things like newspapers and educational institutions and being aware of the parallels of what was going on elsewhere, because some of these families from Eastern Europe that we knew, one brother went to North America, one went to Australia, one went to South Africa, and then they kept tabs as to where and how. Yeah? And always that contrast between making a home, pretending like you were going to be settled, but having a bag packed, having money somewhere else, having contacts somewhere else. So that kind of a sensibility is extraordinary in all of this. And it leads me to another thing I wanted to ask you about, and that is that this question of nationalism. You talk about the national disease in the book, right? And the story of nationalism haunts a good deal of what's going on here, because there's the desire for it, and yet the sense, the experience of the fact that it's built on a kind of sacrificial violence, right? And that from that point of view, it's always creating this kind of the spin-off of its own fragmentation, of the horror of the violence that was involved, and of those who were making the sacrifice. So there was both a skepticism of it, but also, in a sense, a desire for the comforts and the securities that it could bring. And it's so beautifully illustrated in your story by the question of what kind of papers count. Do you really have a passport? You have a passport that was just really something to get certain kinds of immigrants into the country in Peru, but it wasn't real citizenship. So there's that whole kind of, so in your story, there's this question of both the kind of perilous position of the nationalists, and one has to admit that however critical one is, when Arendt says that the stateless and the nationalists were available for slaughter in many ways because that's precisely what they were. This is a powerful thing, and one can understand how the response to that might be a hyper kind of nationalism, a desire for it. Right? But on the other hand, of course, there's that sense, as we were mentioning earlier, that a true international feels that you create nationalism so that you can transcend it, and that the whole issue of a certain kind of Jewish presence was that you were distributed among the nations, and you were a ferment wherever you went. There was so that leads me to ask the question: where does that leave you? You talk towards the end a little bit about your own feelings about this, right? And you say, you're kind of a Zapatista. You have that attitude in relation to what it, to belonging, right? That in a sense you have to work for it to have it, but do you really want it, kind of thing? So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because I mean, it's true that there was a tremendous amount of longing for nationhood in my grandparents' generation. My mother too. My mother, who didn't have a nationality until the family emigrated to Israel in 1949. She got her first passport was an Israeli emergency passport, and she was already 18 then. So my mother was also very concerned with nationality and wanting to belong. But my family immigrated to Mexico City when I was 11, and Mexico has never been, it's a little bit more open now than it was, but has never really been a melting pot in its view of itself. And so at a certain point, I felt like, well, I don't know. I think I might have sublimated that and thought, well, I'm glad that I don't have to really belong entirely, because I'm not going to really try, let's say, put it that way, because I know that I can be excluded. I've always felt that I'm excludable. I've always known, it's not that I've felt, I've always known that I can easily be excluded. And I think it's true. I think it's a fact. And writing this book certainly confirmed it, rather than, made me feel any otherwise. So for a long time, I didn't even try to take the Mexican nationality. I only took the Mexican nationality a few years ago, 4 years ago. And by then, I'd already taken a few years before then the American nationality. So I kind of feel that there's no way, for me personally, there's no way that I can exist without being in some level excludable. And so that's what, when I say that I'm a Zapatista with regard to nationality, what I mean is that belonging is connected to one's work, to one's experience, to one's life, and that nobody can take away from you. That's the one thing that they can't really take from you, and I feel that way, and I don't identify that much with my mother. Was always someone who wanted to take root, and my father was always someone my father was a German Jew who arrived in Chile in 1938, having fled first to Belgium with his parents. Never wanted to take root. He never wanted to buy a piece of property, that. So I had both of those strands, and in the end, I took the Zapatista way, which is the land belongs to those who work it kind of attitude.
But I think you have that attitude too, Claudio, surely also to the intellectual project of community making, right? Because you're also intensely involved in things like, journalism, writing columns that are about, local events, writing theatre that relates to a particular history in a place. So it's not that one doesn't involve oneself in the collective work of a community. Mm-hmm. It's whether it's a nationalist community in that sense that seems to be the key.
And the nationalist part, I mean, my grandparents in the 20s and Mariátegui in the 20s and 30s, they had, and 40s, I think still, but especially the 30s, 20s, they had a more optimistic view of nationalism, in the sense that I think that they felt exactly as you said, and Lenin felt that way as well, that a universalism was not the opposite of nationalism, but rather that subordinated nationalities needed nationalism, but they needed to transcend it. So nationalism was a step along the way. So for instance, Mariátegui's column, Mariátegui was a journalist in the first place, was called Peruvian, the title of his column was Peruvianizing Peru, right? And so he was committed to rethinking Peru, but that commitment led him to create a journal, Amauta, which was a vanguardist journal that was publishing Freud and was publishing, people from all over the world. So Peruvianizing Peru did not mean reading Peruvians, although it also meant reading Peruvians, but it didn't mean, sort of shutting down the horizon at all. I think that kind of great, which I think was a great moment, that moment of the 1920s, is something to be recovered. But nationalism right now is hard for me to feel very identified with it.
Well, particularly at this moment, I think it's specifically difficult. Maybe just as something to conclude with, I just wanted to raise the fact precisely of this, this Peruvian project, and in the 1920s. This is the idea of the kind of red corner, this community, the salon environment that was created there. And I thought that was a wonderful way in which, again, you shifted the kinds of modes of history writing and the scale. There was a real kind of sense there of thick description and your account of how these communities came together, of argument, of debate, of discourse, and how they reached out across the world, but they actually fomented a sense of what was a national intellectual and political project. And it was quite extraordinary how you gave a sense of that. You give the ground plans of the house, the rhythms of the way that things work, the networks that came together there, and ultimately how this extraordinary person is producing this kind of a sophisticated social historical theory of world class, but in this very, very local place. So you stop the narrative, and you actually give us a sense of the social production of that world and those ideas. And I thought that was extraordinarily rich. So it's a wonderful example, this book, of these multiple methodologies and the way they come together and the way that you use your anthropological and historical training to do something that's really quite original, I think. So it was a wonderful book, and I much enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
We don't have any questions from the Q&A just yet. I just want to remind our guests that you're welcome to ask a question using the Q&A feature that's available to you in the webinar. But maybe, Claudio, you could, while we wait to see if there's any questions, you could maybe read a selection from Nuestra América, or Jean, if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to get to.
Well, we could talk all night. Maybe Claudio wants to read us.
Sure. I'll let me read a little something. So this is from the introduction, toward the end of the introduction. It's a section called America. My father knew a lot about geology, and according to his point of view, South America is an immature continent. The Andes were to him dizzyingly dramatic. Mother of stone, foam of condors, as Pablo Neruda put it. As a geophysicist, he did not find peace among such deep stirrings. When I was 4 years old, we took a family trip to Peru. Among my memories of the journey is a stop in Arica, as well as a nauseating plane ride to Pisco. I preserve in my mind an image of the red callous desert of Atacama and of the Morro de Arica, the site where the Peruvian Colonel Alfonso Ugarte threw himself into the abyss rather than surrender to the Chilean army, and the taking of the frigate El Huáscar in that same War of the Pacific of 1879, when the Chilean army beat Peru and Bolivia and appropriated their southernmost provinces. In those days, we boys still played with lacquered lead soldiers, and as a proud Chilean, all of this fascinated me. I also remember an afternoon among the cliffs of the Antofagasta coast, walking with my brothers looking for anemones and starfish. The sun-filled and freezing Pacific snorted up between the slender tongues of perforated rock. An octopus hid itself in the whirlpool. Later, in Lima's Chorrillos neighborhood, I read a plaque commemorating the struggle of the valiant Peruvian people, quote, against Chilean barbarism. I was four then and read rather slowly, so that when I finally came to the part on the Chilean invaders, I cried out in disbelief. Mami, it says here, Chilean barbarians. We good-hearted Chileans were barbarians? In Lima, we also visited an archaeological dig. My grandfather Misha was there, although I don't recall how he got there or why. He knew the archaeologists, or at least he knew how to approach them, because they allowed us to touch the cloth that covered some mummies that they were removing. I remember them giving him a strip of that ancient cloth, although I might be mistaken about that. This was my first contact with the magic of antiquity. The dryness of the Peruvian coastal desert can preserve cloth for hundreds and even thousands of years. and it was possible to touch that cloth, to interrogate it. My grandparents did not accompany us to Cusco or on the rest of that trip because of Misha's heart condition. There was once a photograph of my grandfather at that spot, but now I can't find it. I substitute it with another of the self-same Misha, but young and in a different locale in Peru. He has in his lap a skull, as if he were Hamlet, posing with a pre-Incan Yorick. To be or not to be indigenous, or better put, as the great Brazilian modernist Oswald Andrade would write at around that same time, Tupi or not Tupi? Was this perhaps the question my grandfather was asking? I doubt it. More likely, as the committed Jew and Marxist that he was at that time, he was inclined to see the present reflected in the mirror of Incan glory. Today's Indians, though subjugated, would once again become great. Though imperiled, the Jews were also once again becoming great. This was the source of his energy and enthusiasm for Hebrew, as well as for his passion for the emancipatory spark that he intuited in indigenous communalism. My grandfather was not then a wavering prince like Hamlet. Rather, he was a man compelled to create a future out of a present that was always precarious, and from a past that was crumbling around him. For him, the idea of a new world was a necessity. His idea of America had less to do with nostalgia for the past than with a reality that needed to be achieved. Our America, the America of my family, was a necessary place that one must inhabit and defend.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions. The first from a viewer who asks, can you tell us more about your approach? What does writing a historical autobiographical ethnography, if you would characterize it as that, entail?
That's a really hard question. That's a super hard question. I can describe what I did, but I can't really provide an analytic, I don't think. The first part of the approach, I think, to me is about being motivated to write it. I had an interest in some of these stories that came from my families, and I had made recordings with my mother and with some uncles, and I tried to interview my father, who was very hard to interview, several times, years before writing this. And the spark for writing was really different from the interest in the lore that I had before. So the motivation for writing is something that I can't really summarize. I think that it's a book that I wrote at a certain point in my life and that I couldn't have written at other points in my life. It's a moment of reflection. The book is not exactly an autobiography, but it is also not an autobiography. I mean, it ends during my childhood, but one of the questions that helped me was to try to understand my childhood, to try to understand, not my childhood, but one thing about my childhood, which is, how was it possible that I had a happy childhood? How was that possible given my family history? And what kind of an achievement was that? And whose achievement was it? And that involves dealing with the problem of forgetting in a different way than if you're a historian, the problem of forgetting is always just frustrating, period. That's it, right? So something is lost. But if you're a child and you've been spared from something because it's been forgotten, the process of forgetting is a little bit of a gift sometimes, and it's actually sometimes difficult to achieve that oblivion. So I think that in this respect, I used what I could, which was anthropology, ethnography, my training as a historian as well, in order to try to to give some kind of flesh to something that otherwise would have been a completely just a spectral thing, because there's so much deliberate forgetting, and that that's the space I think that I was trying to get at.
Thank you. There's one more question. A viewer writes in, what was your process of collecting and uncovering the raw historical documents that helped you to piece together your family's history? And what were you most surprised by?
Because my family on both sides moved around a lot, sometimes in exile, sometimes as migrants. They weren't the best keepers of documents, but they did keep some documents, although they would tend to be dispersed in the family. So the formation of the archive for this book was a deeply collective kind of an exercise, both in terms of reaching inside of the family, including reaching inside of the family to people who I didn't have contact with before, or very little contact, or who I hadn't had contact with in 30, 40 years. But also outside of the family. One of the wonderful things to me about this book was that it's a book that relied a lot on friendships, and relied a lot on friendships that I had, but also relied on friendships that I didn't have, but that the book gave me. Because, for instance, in the latter part of the book, there's the story of my father's side of the family, and there's a story of the murder of my father's grandfather. And this story I had, had been able to get a little bit of, but then I received a letter from Karen Strobel, an archivist in Mannheim, which was where my great grandfather was murdered. And she'd been working on this assassination with a colleague of hers, and just shared this huge archival findings about this, which I would have never been able to access without her. Or in the case of Colombia too, I had the help of someone this wonderful writer, Gustavo Alvarez Gardiazabal, from Tuluá, who went and interviewed people for me, and we've never met. But we had a friend in common. So a lot of the work for this did involve collaboration and finding collaborators. Historians always, everything that people already wrote, right? The books or papers are collaborators. In that sense, the work of the historian is based on some form of friendship, but this book relied on that very, very much. And there's, because the family archive is very choppy, you have to read what you have very carefully, and try to weave your way between the artifact, whatever it is that you have, the photo, the envelope, the letter, the article that your grandfather wrote or something, to weave that through other reading. Otherwise, it won't speak on its own well enough. And in terms of surprising things, one of the things that this work did was it restored people to me. People, for instance, my paternal grandmother, who I'd loved a lot, but she died when I was, in my early 20s. But I had a lot of mixed feelings about her, and in the process of writing some of her context, which is an example of the stuff that had been forgotten, like this great grandfather's assassination by the Freikorps, that is sort of the early Nazi movement in the 1920s in Germany, early 20s, it led me to reconstruct her story in a way that was not available to my father, and certainly not to me. And in some way, both made me understand her a lot more, but also helped take some of the edges off of me, because I think one of the things that at least family history can do to you sometimes is give you some harsh corners there, and I have them, and I think it made me a little less harsh.
It's wonderful. We've reached the we got one more question here, and it's a viewer writes in: Did writing this book, related to this question, did writing this book change your perception of your family or cement it?
It to a large extent cemented it. I think that you know, they grew in my estimation, and but that's already telling you that how bloated, you know, my estimation might be, because I had them in high esteem beforehand, but they grew in my estimation because these are generations, and this is a book that most of it transpires in the first half of the 20th century. It ends, you know, in the 70s, in the 1970s, and so those generations lived through a lot, and a lot that is actually very meaningful for us now. That's another thing. I think that the book is meaningful because there's a lot in there that is disturbingly reminiscent of our present, and so reaching back to them is not just an act of, in my case, an act of, you know, it is a pious act, always reaching to the past, and writing history is always, I think, a pious act. But I have to say, in this case, it's also an act that's selfish and that's for us, because there's something about that story that is deeply instructive, I think, for us.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Claudio Lomnitz, Eugene Kamarov, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. It's a pleasure to have you both. Hope to someday have you both in the store when conditions allow, back when we're hosting events in our store. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Also, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And we'll see you at the next event. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Gene.
Thank you, Claudio. Lovely to see you.
Good night, all.
Done.